The dead don't ring doorbells. That's what I told myself the moment mine did twice, at exactly 3:07 a.m. The sound sliced through the silence like something out of a dream I couldn't wake from. My house was wrapped in darkness, the kind that feels heavy, absolute. For a few seconds, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the world to make sense again. But when the chime came a third time, slow, deliberate, patient, I knew I wasn't dreaming. I swung my legs out of bed, the floorboards groaning under my feet. Out here on the edge of Maplewood, no one visited at that hour. Raccoons sometimes tripped the porch light, maybe a delivery truck groaning down the highway miles away, but never a person at my door. My phone screen flared to life. 3:07 a.m. Tuesday. I opened the security app, expecting to see an empty porch, maybe a stray shadow. Instead, my breath stopped. There he was, a man standing motionless beneath the awning, looking straight into the doorbell camera, as if he knew I'd be watching. His face was pale under the porch light, the edges of his hair damp with mist. Even before the image sharpened, my heart recognized what logic refused to. I knew that face. I had kissed that forehead goodbye at a funeral 6 years ago. It was David, my brother, older, thinner, eyes haunted by something I couldn't name, but him beyond question. The scar above his eyebrow, the slight tilt of his mouth when he tried not to cry, the posture that had once annoyed me for slouching at every family photo. Every detail struck me like lightning. He was supposed to be gone, burned, buried, mourned, and gone. I had planned his service, chosen the white roses myself, signed the death certificate with shaking hands. Now he was standing on my porch, alive. I froze, watching him glance over his shoulder as if someone followed. His lips moved, one word, maybe two, but the audio didn't catch it. I whispered his name, absurdly hoping he'd hear me through the screen. When I blinked, he was gone. The porch lay empty, the motion light flickering, the only trace a set of wet footprints leading down the steps and vanishing into the darkness. My mind spun. A twin, a lookalike, some cruel prank. Yet every beat of my heart insisted otherwise. I knew my brother's face like a map etched into memory. The face I'd cried over, the one I still spoke to when the nights felt too long. I sat down at the kitchen table, replaying the footage over and over, the house creaking around me. With each replay, the disbelief faded and the chill deepened. If David was alive, someone had lied. Someone powerful enough to fake a death, to forge a funeral, to keep me silent for 6 years. The coffee pot clicked on automatically, its quiet hiss filling the silence. I didn't move. The clock on the wall ticked toward 3:10 a.m. as I stared at the frozen image of my brother's face on the screen. A ghost caught in digital proof. And that's how the night that changed everything began. With a doorbell, a camera, and the impossible return of the man I'd already buried. My name is Margaret Lewis, and 6 years ago, I buried my brother with my own trembling hands. Not literally, of course. The casket was closed, sealed by the coroner's orders, but I was the one who signed the death certificate, arranged the funeral, and chose the white lilies David once teased me for loving. I remember the priest's voice breaking as he read from the Psalms, and how I clutched the folded flag the company sent in recognition of his service. Service, they called it, though David had never worn a uniform. He'd worked for a private shipping firm, one that claimed he died in a warehouse explosion on the docks. Back then, I didn't question much. I was exhausted from the years of watching David spiral, the gambling, the fast deals, the promises that he'd quit after one last run. Every time my phone rang late, I'd brace for bad news. So when the call finally came from his supervisor, saying there'd been an accident, I'd already rehearsed my grief 100 times in my head. Still, nothing prepared me for the sight of that sealed casket, for the knowledge that I'd never see his face again. I remember standing in the chapel, surrounded by people who spoke about David like he was a myth, the loyal worker, the devoted son, the man who died doing what he loved. None of them knew the truth, that he'd been running scared, desperate to clear debts that I could never quite understand. I wanted to scream that he hadn't loved that job, that he'd hated every second of it. But I just smiled through the ache, the way widows and sisters are expected to, and thanked them for coming. The insurance company processed the payout within weeks, too quickly, I'd later realize. A modest sum enough to repair the roof and pay the lingering medical bills from my late husband's illness. At the time, I told myself it was divine mercy after years of loss. I never saw it as a trade, not my brother's life for comfort. I'd have given it all back for one more conversation with him, one chance to say, "You can still come home." For 6 years, I lived inside that fragile peace. My world became smaller, safer morning walks, my garden, volunteering at the clinic. I learned to live with the quiet. I stopped checking the news about the docks, stopped driving by his old haunts. The ache dulled into memory, the kind that only stings when you breathe too deeply. I tell myself that David was finally at rest, that some souls burn too bright to last long. And then came that night, 3:07 a.m., the chime that shattered everything. The moment I saw his face on that doorbell feed, the ground beneath those 6 years crumbled. Every signature, every condolence card, every whispered prayer at his grave, all of it turned to smoke. I sat in that same kitchen where I'd written thank you notes after the funeral, staring at his image on my phone. My brother alive, older, gaunter, but undeniably real. I felt something raw and unfamiliar stir inside me, not joy, not even fear at first, but anger. Anger at the lie at the waist, at myself for ever believing he was gone. I thought I'd made peace with his death. But as I replayed that video over and over, I realized something crueler. I hadn't buried my brother at all. I'd buried the truth. And now, like a ghost clawing up through the earth, it was coming back for me. Before David became a ghost in the camera feed, he was my whole world. We grew up in a weather-beaten house on the edge of Maple Creek, Ohio. A town so small that the diner waitress knew everyone's middle name, and your heart breaks before you did. Ours was a modest life, patched together with second-hand clothes and Sunday hope. When our parents died in that winter car crash, I was 14, and David was 17, old enough to sign papers, young enough to cry when he thought I was asleep. He swore he'd take care of me, and somehow he did. He fixed the leaking roof with duct tape and stubbornness, learned to cook eggs because I couldn't stand the smell of the burnt ones, and took shifts at the gas station until his hands were black with oil. Every night, he'd promise me, "We'll get out of this town someday, Mags. Just hang on." He was my brother, my protector, my reckless hero. But even back then, I saw the flicker of something dangerous in him, that restless need to chase what glittered, no matter who warned him it might burn. In high school, people loved David. He had that easy smile, the kind that made teachers forgive late homework and girls write his name in ink across their notebooks. I was the opposite, quiet, cautious, always double-checking bus schedules and saving lunch money for books instead of sodas. David used to tease me, "Margaret, you plan your life like it's a medical chart." And you, I'd fire back, "Live like you're allergic to consequences." We laughed, but deep down, we both knew it was true. After graduation, I went to nursing school while David bounced from job to job. Construction, car sales, poker nights that turned into debts. He'd come home with bruised knuckles and a grin, saying, "Don't worry, sis, I've got it under control." But I always knew he didn't. Still, we were bound by something stronger than common sense, shared loss. When life took everything else, we only had each other. He was my last piece of family, my only photograph worth framing. I remember one summer evening, before everything changed, we sat by the riverbank, fireflies blinking around us like tiny lanterns. David skipped stones across the water, his reflection breaking apart with each throw. "Do you ever wonder what Mom and Dad would think of us?" I asked. He smirked. "They'd say you turned out perfect, and I turned out interesting." We laughed. Then he said quietly, "Don't ever stop believing in me, Mags. I need at least one person in this world who still does." I wish I'd known how heavy that promise would become, because loving David, protecting him, meant standing too close to his storms. Years later, when the police called to say his car had gone off the bridge during a rainstorm, part of me wasn't surprised. Shocked, yes. Destroyed, absolutely. But not surprised. Recklessness had always been his companion, and I'd spent half my life trying to keep him from it. That night, I realized I'd failed both as a sister and as the last person who still believed he could change. Now, watching his face on my doorbell camera 6 years later, older, thinner, eyes hollow, but alive, I could feel the past rushing back like floodwater. The boy who once promised to protect me was now the man I'd buried. And the truth standing on my porch threatened to wash away everything I'd built to survive him. Some people say time heals, but time doesn't heal what refuses to stay buried. David always said the sea called to him, that he was meant for horizons bigger than Ohio. When he joined a private shipping firm based out of Cleveland, I wanted to believe it was his fresh start, a steady job, a uniform, a chance to rebuild. But the first time I saw him after he signed on, there was something different in his eyes. Not joy, not even pride, something restless, like a man standing on a bridge with water rising fast beneath him. He told me they handled special cargo, small runs up and down the Great Lakes, nothing too serious. But his knuckles were split, his smile tight, and the faint smell of oil clung to his jacket. I didn't press, not then. A nurse learns early that some wounds bleed more when touched. was months later, over coffee at my kitchen table, that I noticed the bruises on his ribs when he reached for his mug. "Fell off the dock," he said, too quickly. I didn't believe him. His paychecks had started arriving irregularly, and yet his bank statements, the few I glimpsed when he left his wallet open, showed sudden deposits with round numbers: $3,000, $5,000, $7,500. They didn't look like wages. They looked like silence money. "David," I said quietly, "whatever you're mixed up in, walk away now. Please." He laughed, not meanly, but with that easy charm that once got him out of speeding tickets and into people's trust. "You worry too much, Mags," he said. "I've got this under control. One last run, and I'm done." He always said one last run. It became a promise and an excuse in the same breath. That night, after he left, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with my tea gone cold, staring at the faint ring his cup had left behind. That circle haunted me, an unfinished loop, like every conversation we never truly finished. I wrote him an email the next morning, something small but careful. "If you ever need a place to rest, my door is open." No questions asked. He didn't reply. A week later, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Static, muffled voices, then a low tone, and a sound that might have been waves. I told myself it was nothing. You can't live your whole life fearing what might be. But fear has a way of settling into your bones when love is the reason. Every instinct told me something was wrong. His social media went quiet. His friends, the ones who used to tag him in bar photos, stopped mentioning him altogether. The company he worked for, Silverline Maritime Logistics, had no real website, no HR department, no listed address beyond a P.O. box. I called it once, pretending to ask about a delivery position. A man answered with a thick accent and hung up after 3 words. "No openings now." I remember the click of that call more vividly than most conversations in my life. It was the sound of a door closing between us. When I confronted David in person the final time, it was raining hard, and he'd shown up at my porch soaked through, shivering but defiant. "You think you're the only one trying to survive," he snapped when I told him I'd called his employer. "You think you know better just because you play by the rules." His anger wasn't cruelty, it was pride, wounded and flailing. I saw the same boy who once swore he'd never let me go hungry, now drowning in something he couldn't control. I reached for him, but he pulled back. "After this run, I'll quit," he said again. "I promise." Those were the last words that sounded like my brother. A week later came the call from the detective. The words accident, unidentified body, riverbank, blurred into static. I remember gripping the phone until my fingers went numb, staring at the rain streaking my window like the world itself was weeping. They said it looked like he'd lost control of his car, gone through the guardrail. But no one could tell me what he'd been transporting that night, or why his phone records stopped 2 hours before impact. I asked for the police report, the towing receipt, the autopsy, all the ordinary paperwork that makes death official. I thought facts might dull the pain. They didn't. For years, I tried to remember David as the boy who carried me home from the playground, not the man who carried too many secrets. But as I stared at his face on that camera 6 years later, alive against every truth I'd signed my name to, I realized something unbearable. Maybe he hadn't been running cargo all those years. Maybe he'd been running from something or someone I never saw coming. And now, whatever he'd escaped from had followed him home. I got the call. I was folding laundry, something ordinary, something safe. My phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. A man's voice, flat and tired, said, "Mrs. Lewis, I'm calling about your brother, David Monroe. There's been an explosion." I remember sitting down without realizing it, the sound of the washing machine humming like a heartbeat in the background. "Explosion where?" I asked. "At the Lakeview docks," he said. "There were multiple casualties. We believe your brother was among them." The words "believe" and "among" hung in the air like smoke. He said they'd need dental records for confirmation. That was the moment my hands started to shake. When I arrived at the county morgue 2 days later, the smell of disinfectant hit me like a wall. They handed me a clipboard with forms, terms I couldn't process: charred remains, limited identification, restricted viewing. I tried to read, but the letters blurred. The coroner, a woman with kind eyes, said quietly, "It's best you don't look, ma'am. The damage was extensive." Instead, she showed me a folder: x-rays, dental comparisons, photographs I couldn't make myself see. The name David Monroe was typed neatly at the top. She said the match was conclusive. I nodded, though my heart whispered, "You didn't see him." They released the remains within 48 hours, unusually fast, I'd later learn. The paperwork came stamped "case concluded" before I'd even caught my breath. Silverline Maritime handled the funeral arrangements, sent a representative I'd never met, a man named Victor Hale, who wore an expensive suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He said the company wanted to honor David's service and covered all costs: casket, transport, burial. At the time, I told myself that was generous. In hindsight, it felt more like they wanted the whole matter buried with him. The funeral was small, closed casket, of course. The pastor spoke about storms and redemption, about how some men find peace only in heaven. I sat in the front pew, clutching a folded handkerchief, staring at that polished box of wood that was supposed to hold my brother. The only sound I remember was the steady patter of rain against the church roof. People said the timing was merciful, that the rain washed away the ashes, the questions, the guilt. But I remember watching the water run off the hearse, like tears the world shed in my place. After the service, a police officer handed me a single-page summary: explosion caused by equipment malfunction. No foul play suspected. I asked if I could see the full report. He hesitated, then said it wasn't necessary. The evidence was clear, the case closed. He offered condolences and turned to leave. That was the first time I felt something shift beneath the weight of my grief. Not doubt exactly, but a faint unease, like realizing a picture frame on the wall has been slightly tilted for years. In the weeks that followed, I moved through the motions: the insurance paperwork, the condolence calls, the casseroles left on my porch. Grief is strange that way. It makes you efficient. I packed up David's apartment myself, sorting through his things in silence. His clothes still smelled faintly of salt and engine oil. I found his watch on the nightstand, still ticking, though the date was wrong. There were no photos newer than a year old, no letters, no notebooks, nothing personal. Only a half-empty duffel bag with shipping invoices. and a single envelope marked Silverline Payroll. Inside was a check stub dated 2 days after the explosion. I told myself it was an accounting error, that companies made mistakes all the time. But the thought dug into me like a splinter. When I called the payroll office, the line rang once and disconnected. When I called again, the number was no longer in service. I could have pursued it, demanded answers, but I didn't. I was tired, and tired people accept what they're told if it means the pain might stop sooner. I told myself that efficiency was kindness, that the world had spared me worse images, harder truths. That first night after the burial, I sat on my porch with a candle burning low beside me. The wind kept threatening to snuff it out. I thought of David, of how many times he'd promised just one last run. Maybe this was his peace, I told myself, a life cut short but finally quiet. Yet, somewhere deep down, another thought whispered, what if he didn't die? What if he ran again, and this time the lie was what saved him? I buried that thought the same way I'd buried him, deep, neat, sealed. For 6 years, I lived inside that quiet. Until the night the doorbell rang at 3:07 a.m., and the camera showed me the face I was told could no longer exist. And in that instant, all the words stamped concluded on those papers burned away, leaving only the one question I'd been too afraid to ask. If David wasn't in that coffin, who was? After the funeral, life did what it always does. It kept moving, even when I didn't want to follow. The insurance settlement came through 6 months later, $148,000 from David's life policy, a sum I never asked for but couldn't refuse. The company's letter said it was a final compensation for the loss of valued personnel. I used the money to pay off my mortgage, repair the old porch swing he'd built for me years ago, and tuck away the rest in a savings account I barely touched. It felt wrong to profit from his death, but the world measures closure in documents and decimals. I told myself this was part of letting go. The house grew quieter as the seasons turned. My husband, Paul, passed 2 years later after a long heart battle, and his absence filled the rooms like fog, slow, dense, impossible to clear. For months, I spoke less to people and more to the garden. Roses, especially, became my language. I'd whisper David's name to the soil while pruning the stems, telling him that the red ones were blooming early this year, that Paul would have liked the weather, that I was still managing fine. The mind invents rituals when the heart has too much to carry. I kept David's photograph on the mantle, the one from his 27th birthday, with his hair still sun-bleached from the lake and a mischievous smile that made it hard to stay mad at him. Whenever the world felt heavy, I'd look at that picture and speak as if he were still out there, listening. You finally found peace, didn't you? I'd say softly, half a prayer, half a question. For 6 years, I believed he had. Those were quiet years, not happy exactly, but calm in their predictability. I rose with the light, volunteered twice a week at the clinic, hosted tea for the church ladies on Sundays. My days blurred together in the best way, no sharp edges, no new grief. Sometimes, at night, I'd dream of David by the water, waving before turning toward a horizon that never ended. I'd wake up comforted, convinced he'd found some gentle corner of eternity. And then, of course, life did what it does when you start to trust it again. It shifted. Small things at first, my dog barking at the porch for no reason, the faint sound of footsteps in the gravel that vanished when I turned on the light. Once, I found fresh boot prints by the mailbox, too large to be mine, too deep for the postman's route. I brushed them off as tricks of the weather. After all, who imagines ghosts in daylight? But looking back, I wonder if some part of me already knew. Grief is clever that way. It doesn't just fade, it rearranges itself into superstition. I began to feel watched, not in a threatening way, but in a familiar one. Like the air itself was holding its breath. That evening before the doorbell, I'd fallen asleep in the armchair beside the fireplace, a half-read book open on my lap. The embers were low, the world wrapped in stillness. I remember thinking how grateful I was for peace, the kind you earn only after surviving the worst. And then, a few hours later, peace shattered with a single sound. Ding-dong. When I saw his face on that camera, my brother's face, older, wearier, but undeniably his, everything I'd built in those 6 quiet years began to tremble. The savings, the garden, the prayers, even the conversations I'd had with his photograph, all suddenly became part of a lie I hadn't known I was living. For 6 years, I believed in rest. Now I was staring straight into resurrection, and it terrified me. I must have watched that doorbell clip 100 times before dawn. Each replay felt like peeling away a layer of disbelief and finding something colder beneath. The camera's timestamp read 3:07:14 a.m. The motion light flickered on, washing the porch in pale yellow. And there he was, David, standing just beyond the mat, one hand braced on the railing, his chest rising fast, his eyes scanning the darkness like a hunted man. His clothes were soaked, clinging to him, streaked with grime and what looked like dried blood. He glanced straight into the lens once, just once, and the look in his eyes hollowed me out. It wasn't shock or guilt. It was recognition. The logical part of me, the nurse, the widow, the woman who had signed the papers, whispered that it couldn't be real. Lighting tricks. A glitch. Maybe someone who looked like him, trying to scare me or scam me. But each time I hit replay, my certainty wavered. The small scar above his right eyebrow, the one from when he fell off his bike at 12, was there. So was the tiny notch on his left ear. Even his stance was familiar, weight shifted slightly to the right, just like Dad used to do. These weren't details you could fake. He moved strangely, though stiff, favoring one side as if injured. Every few seconds he'd glance over his shoulder, toward the road that curved past my house and disappeared into the trees. Once he mouthed something. I froze the frame, rewound, played it in slow motion. His lips formed 2 words, barely visible under the camera glare. "Help me." I whispered them aloud, and my breath caught in my throat. When the clip ended, I sat staring at the darkened screen, my reflection trembling back at me. I told myself I should call someone, the police, the hospital, anyone. But what would I say? My dead brother just rang my doorbell. They'd think I'd lost my mind. So I did what grief had trained me to do. I waited. I replayed the footage again, searching for something, a shadow, a sound, a clue. In the background, faint but clear, I heard another noise, an engine idling, then cutting off. It was distant, but not far. Someone had been with him. It took me nearly 10 minutes to gather the courage to step outside. The air was heavy with mist, the kind that makes every sound seem closer than it is. My porch light swayed slightly in the wind. There was no one there. The yard was empty, the gate ajar. But then I saw them, muddy footprints, half smudged, but unmistakable, leading down the steps and across the gravel drive toward the road. My heart thudded as I followed them barefoot, feeling the cold earth through my nightgown. They ended near the mailbox, where tire tracks cut deep into the mud, curving away toward town. Whoever had been here, whoever had taken him, had left fast. I stood there for what felt like hours, the night pressing close, the hum of the distant highway, the only proof the world was still turning. My mind tried to anchor itself to reason. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. But my heart rebelled. My heart insisted it was David, alive and afraid, trying to reach me before someone or something stopped him. When I went back inside, I downloaded the footage to my laptop, afraid the system might overwrite it. Then I printed still frames, his face, the timestamp, the faint outline of a vehicle's headlights in the far corner of the screen. I laid them out across the dining table like evidence in a case no one else would believe existed. My hands trembled as I traced the image of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the haunted look in his eyes. For 6 years, I had prayed for peace for both of us. Now, staring at those images, I realized peace might have been built on a lie. If David was alive, then the death I'd accepted, the closure I'd built my life around, had been stolen. And if he was, then something far stranger had come to my door. As dawn began to break, the first light of morning fell across the table, pale and cold. I looked again at that final still David glancing over his shoulder, mid-step, as if someone had called his name. I could almost hear the faint echo of my own voice answering him. "I'm here, David. I see you." But seeing wasn't believing anymore. Seeing was the start of unraveling. And as the sun rose over my quiet street, I knew the only way to keep my sanity was to find out what the truth really was, even if it meant reopening a grave I'd already stood beside once. Sleep never came after that night. I sat at my kitchen table as dawn bled through the curtains, surrounded by ghosts made of paper, David's death certificate, the insurance letters, the police report I once tucked away like a tombstone. The more I stared, the more the ink seemed to shift. His name was spelled right, but the signature at the bottom, mine, looked slightly slanted, as if forged by someone trying too hard to imitate my hand. My pulse kicked. I fetched my old nursing files from the closet, the ones where I'd signed 1,000 forms over 30 years, and compared them side by side. No question, the stroke of the M was wrong. My hands trembled as I picked up the coroner's report next. The seal, once reassuringly embossed, looked printed, flat, digital, as though someone had downloaded an image and pasted it on official paper. I felt my stomach knot. 6 years ago, I had been too shattered to notice, too willing to trust that grief didn't need inspection. By mid-morning, I was already in my car, driving toward the county record's office in that same small Ohio town where I'd buried my brother and my certainty. The woman behind the glass, new face, young, polite, took my documents and typed for a long while. I watched the flicker of confusion cross her face. Then came the hesitation. "Mrs. Lewis," she said slowly, "this coroner, Dr. Haynes, was dismissed a year after your brother's case." My breath caught. "Dismissed for what?" I asked. She leaned closer, voice lowered. "Discrepancies. Missing autopsy reports, misfiled identities. We don't talk about it much." I felt the room tilt. The papers in my hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. On the drive home, I couldn't stop imagining the night of the explosion. What if the body in that casket had never been David's? What if he'd staged it all? Or worse, someone else had used his death as cover. Every truth I'd leaned on, the priest's words at the graveside, the condolence cards, the insurance deposit that paid for my husband's medication. All of it now felt tainted, counterfeit. By the time I reached my driveway, my garden looked strange to me, like I'd been living inside a dream someone else had scripted. I went inside, spread the files across the table again, and whispered to no one, "David, what did you do?" The house seemed to listen. Somewhere outside, a dog barked at nothing. I followed the sound, heart thudding, and realized I was no longer sure if I was the sister searching for answers or the woman being hunted by the truth. The road to the docks hadn't changed much. Same rusting cranes, same salt-stung air, same hollow clang of chains slapping against forgotten poles. Yet the place felt smaller now, like a wound that never fully closed. The old warehouse sat beyond a chain-link fence, plastered with no trespassing signs, its metal shell charred black and eaten by years of rain. This was where I'd been told my brother's body was found, or what was left of it. I stood there for a long time, fingers gripping the fence, the smell of diesel and brine crawling back through memory. I thought I'd come for closure, but what I really brought was doubt. A flashlight beam caught me off guard. "Ma'am, you can't be here," a voice called. A night guard in a faded security jacket approached, wary but not unkind. I explained that I'd lost someone here years ago, that I just needed a minute. Something in my voice must have softened him, because his shoulders eased. "Lot of folks lost people here," he said. "But this fire was different." I asked what he meant. He hesitated, glanced over his shoulder, then lowered his tone. "A few months after the explosion, feds came through. Quiet sweep. Said the company was fronting for something dirty, stolen cargo, maybe drugs. Whole thing vanished off the record." My chest tightened. "Did they find anyone?" He nodded slowly. "One guy walked away. Burned bad, left with a limp and a scar down the side of his face. Wouldn't give his name. Just said, 'Tell her I made it out.'" The words struck like a physical blow. My knees wavered. "Tell who?" I asked, though I already knew. The guard squinted, studying my face under the dim yard light. "You got his eyes," he said finally. I pressed a hand to my chest, forcing air into my lungs. "Where did he go?" "No idea," he shrugged. "Van picked him up. They said he was part of a witness transfer thing, but he trailed off. Lady, if your kin was mixed up in this, you might want to stop digging. That fire wasn't an accident." His warning hung heavy between us, thick as the harbor fog rolling in from the water. I thanked him, though my voice barely worked. When I turned back toward my car, I could almost hear the echo of David's laughter, that same reckless sound from our teenage years when he swore nothing could kill him. I followed the cracked asphalt past the ruined warehouses, headlights catching shards of glass that winked like false stars. The night felt alive, whispering with ghosts. For the first time since 3:07 a.m., I didn't just want answers, I needed them. Because if David had survived, that meant someone had helped him disappear. And if someone helped him disappear, then maybe someone wanted him to stay gone. 2 days after the warehouse visit, I opened my mailbox expecting bills and grocery flyers, the dull rhythm of widowhood. But instead, a single folded note lay inside, creased and damp from the morning dew. My name wasn't written on it, only the faint imprint of my address smudged in blue ink. I unfolded it with care, like something sacred and forbidden. The handwriting hit me first, familiar loops and slanted letters I'd know anywhere. David. My heart stuttered as I read the words. Don't tell anyone you saw me. They'll come for you too. The paper trembled in my hands, though it wasn't the wind that moved it. For a long time, I just stood there on the porch, robe fluttering, coffee cooling beside me, staring at the scrawl that pulled me backward 6 years, and yet somehow forward into danger. It wasn't a ghost that rang my doorbell. It was my brother, alive, terrified, and hunted. That night, I sat by the window, lights off, waiting for movement beyond the hedges. My mind kept replaying every possibility: witness protection, cartel revenge, government cover-up. Each theory more absurd than the last, and yet each one fit the look in his eyes from that grainy doorbell footage. The next morning, I found tire marks near my mailbox, still fresh, still wet from the night's drizzle. Then, as I stepped onto the porch, I saw it. A black sedan parked at the edge of the street, engine idling, no one getting out. My pulse roared in my ears. The car sat there for nearly 10 minutes, windows tinted too dark to see through, before gliding away without a sound. I didn't tell the neighbors. I didn't call the police. I knew better. If David warned me not to speak, it meant silence was survival. Still, every creak of the floorboards and whisper of the wind sounded like footsteps coming closer. I took out his old photograph, the one from his 25th birthday, before the bruises, before the secrets, and whispered, "What have you done, little brother?" That night, I barely slept. At 2:54 a.m., headlights swept across my curtains again, just once, slow and deliberate, then vanished down the road. I sat frozen, clutching the note like proof of both miracle and curse. Grief had once been my heaviest burden, but this was different. This was fear dressed as hope. For 2 sleepless nights, I lived in the rhythm of fear, the hum of passing engines, the echo of imagined footsteps. By dawn of the 3rd day, I knew I couldn't bear it alone. My hands shook as I scrolled through old contacts until I found the name I hadn't spoken in years. Harris D., retired hospital security, now a licensed private investigator. I still remembered his calm presence during chaotic nights in the ER, the way he handled violent drunks without raising his voice. If anyone could separate delusion from danger, it was him. When he answered, his voice was the same steady gravel I remembered. "Margaret Lewis. Been a long time." I told him everything: the doorbell, the note, the black sedan. Silence stretched through the line before he said, "Send me the footage." I did. He called back within the hour, tone clipped. "That's not a deepfake, Margaret. The lighting's consistent. Reflection matches your porch glass. Whoever that is, he's really there." His words were both validation and verdict. By noon, he arrived at my door, older but broad-shouldered, eyes alert beneath the brim of his cap. He studied the note, the tire tracks, the footage again, pausing often like a man assembling a puzzle no one wanted to see completed. "You said your brother worked for a shipping company before his death?" he asked. I nodded. "Mariner Logistics, out by the docks." He grunted. "That name come up before. Small operation, big money, and wrong kind of cargo." The air seemed to tighten between us. "You think they faked his death?" I whispered. Harris didn't answer right away. "I think somebody wanted your brother off the record. Maybe he wanted that too." He leaned back, scanning my living room with the instinct of a man who trusted nothing on first glance. "I'll need to poke around discreetly. You keep your phone on, curtains closed. And if that car comes back, don't go outside, not even for the mail." His tone left no room for argument. That evening, he called from a payphone who still used those anymore, his voice low. "I found something strange. Mariner Logistics dissolved 6 months after your brother's accident. Their assets were absorbed by a new firm, Silver Point Transport. Same address, same board members, different shell. Guess who filed the closure paperwork?" My breath caught. "Who?" "A paralegal named Donna Haynes, daughter of the coroner, who signed David's death certificate." Spun. My grief, my faith, every quiet year since his burial, all of it tangled in a web of forged seals and family names. "This goes deeper than I thought," Harris continued. "I've seen laundering rings use fake deaths before. It's clean. No witnesses, no audits." His voice softened then, almost paternal. "I'll handle the digging, Margaret. You just stay safe. Whoever left that note doesn't want you involved." But as I watched his taillights fade into the dusk, I realized I already was. You can't unlearn that the dead might be living, or that the living might be hunted. When I locked the door behind him, the house didn't feel safer, only quieter. Still, for the first time since that night, I wasn't entirely alone in the dark. The first officer I spoke to didn't even look up from his keyboard when I mentioned my brother's name. "Mrs. Lewis, that case is closed," he said, tapping the report number like a gavel. "If you're seeing things, maybe it's just unresolved grief." The phrase stung. Unresolved grief, as if grief could manufacture a video feed, a note written in my brother's hand, or muddy footprints on my porch. When I insisted, he sighed and typed something under citizen inquiry, then gestured toward the door. "We'll keep it on file. That's how truth dies, not with violence, but with paperwork and polite dismissal." I drove home shaking, feeling smaller than the steering wheel I gripped. That night, my phone rang twice from an unknown number. The first time, silence. The second, a calm male voice. "Mrs. Lewis, this is Ryan with Interstate Insurance Audit. Just verifying you haven't made recent claim modifications." I frowned. "My brother's policy settled 6 years ago." He paused, then laughed lightly. "Just routine verification." Click. The next morning, another call, same script, different name. By the third, I stopped answering. Still, the unease grew roots. When I went to withdraw cash for groceries, the teller's polite smile faltered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Lewis. Your account's temporarily frozen, fraud review flag." I stared at her, heart thudding. "Fraud? I've had that account for 30 years. She shrugged helplessly. "You'll need to contact compliance." At home, the letter arrived, a generic notice claiming inconsistencies related to insurance disbursement. It didn't accuse, it implied. I felt it like a noose tightening with plausible deniability. When I called Harris, his response was curt but grim. "They're testing your threshold, Margaret, trying to rattle you before you start talking to the right people. If they can label you unstable or dishonest, your testimony dies before you give it." His words clarified what my fear had only hinted. This wasn't coincidence, it was containment. 2 days later, my neighbor, Mrs. Keene, stopped me by the mailbox. "You okay, dear? I heard you were having episodes again." My stomach dropped. Episodes. She looked uncomfortable. "A man came by asking if you'd been mixing medication with wine. Said he was with your insurance." I didn't want to pry. I thanked her and walked inside, trembling. They weren't just erasing records, they were rewriting me. Every call, every rumor, chipped at my credibility like termites under paint. Even the few friends I'd confided in grew cautious, their replies shorter, their tone indulgent. "Maybe you're overthinking this, Margaret." That was the refrain. It's frightening how quickly truth becomes negotiable when whispered by authority. Late one night, I found a voicemail I hadn't noticed earlier. "Mrs. Lewis, this is Detective Ralston from the precinct. Please refrain from contacting retired personnel for active investigations." The message was 30 seconds long, but the implication clear. Someone inside the department had caught wind of Harris's involvement and wanted me isolated. When I forwarded it to him, he texted back, "Burner, don't respond. We're being watched." His calm efficiency steadied me, but even his confidence couldn't blunt the isolation. My world, once defined by small certainties, a garden, a church pew, morning coffee on the porch, had narrowed into passwords and paranoia. By week's end, I received a certified envelope bearing a familiar crest, Department of State Health Services. Inside was a notice of re-examination for David's death certificate. The irony was almost cruel. After years of believing him dead, they were now revalidating his death as if I'd forged it. Every stamp and signature was a dagger turned backward. I pressed my fingers to the seal and whispered to the empty room, "They're not after truth. They're after silence." Somewhere beyond my walls, an engine idled. It stopped when I turned the porch light on. I drew the curtains and sat with the note David had left, the edges worn from rereading. His scrawled warning, "Don't tell anyone you saw me," hadn't been paranoia. It had been protection. Still, a spark of defiance flickered through the exhaustion. They could freeze my accounts, paint me unstable, erase my files. But I still had one thing they couldn't counterfeit: the original footage. The image of my brother alive, frightened, real. I copied it to a flash drive that night, sealing it in an envelope labeled, "If anything happens to me." Truth, however fragile, needed a witness. And even if the world thought I'd lost my mind, I knew better. Lies can be orchestrated, but fear that precise, that human, cannot. When Harris called that morning, his voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before, urgency wrapped in triumph. "Margaret, I found something," he said. "You'd better sit down." He'd been following a thin trail through rental records, one that led to a self-storage facility 2 towns over. The locker had been rented 6 years ago under the name Daniel Harper, but the contact phone number matched David's old prepaid line. "They were sloppy," Harris muttered. "Whoever tried to bury him didn't expect anyone to dig this deep." My breath caught. "What's inside?" Nothing that belongs to the dead, he said grimly. By the time I arrived, the air smelled of dust and cold metal. The manager handed Harris a clipboard, eyes flicking between us. Units overdue for renewal. You'll want gloves, he said, as if we were about to exhume something sacred. Inside, boxes were stacked neatly, labeled household goods, books, tools. But under a false floorboard, Harris's flashlight found a sealed envelope taped to a metal beam. Inside, a small black flash drive and a folded note in David's handwriting. If you're reading this, I failed to stay gone. I pressed the paper to my chest, fighting a wave of dizziness. For 6 years, that handwriting had lived only in memory. Harris took the drive to his office, a converted backroom lined with file cabinets and coffee-stained maps. He plugged it into an offline laptop, eyes narrowing as code filled the screen. Encrypted, he said, but old software. Give me an hour. I watched the cursor blink while the hum of his machines filled the silence. Then, with a soft chime, folders appeared, ship logs, accounts, deceased list. Each one was dated between 2016 and 2019, the years leading up to the accident. Harris opened the first. Rows of entries scrolled by, container numbers, destinations, and annotations marked flagged cargo. Next came spreadsheets detailing insurance payouts, names of employees who'd supposedly died during incidents. My brother's name sat halfway down, highlighted in gray. But beneath it, a separate tab read Whistle Program. Harris clicked. Inside was a memo labeled Internal Use, only Level 3 clearance. The contents made my skin prickle. The company's leadership had built a secret mechanism to protect select insiders who had witnessed illegal shipments. They staged their deaths, paid out fake insurance, and relocated them under new identities in exchange for silence. It wasn't benevolence, it was containment. They turned morality into a transaction, Harris said softly. Your brother must have refused to disappear quietly. One subfolder contained email chains, executives debating how to handle leak exposure. One message, dated a week before the explosion, read, D. Lewis is unstable. Recommend preemptive containment. My vision blurred. Containment, I repeated. That's what they called murder. Harris exhaled slowly. Or an attempt. He must have escaped before they could finish the job. The last folder contained video clips, short, grainy recordings from a warehouse camera. Harris enlarged the frame. There was David, arguing with 2 men in suits near a shipping crate. His gestures were frantic, pointing toward a clipboard. Then a flash, smoke, chaos. The camera jolted and went black. Harris paused the final frame, the timestamp matching the night of the explosion. He was right there when it happened, I whispered. He knew they'd destroy everything. Harris nodded. He left this drive as insurance. If something happened to him, or if he had to vanish, it would expose them. He printed out several pages of the manifests and cross-checked them with corporate filings. They laundered millions through these fake deaths, he said, and if they find out we've got this, they'll want it back. He slipped the drive into a metal case, then handed me a duplicate copy. Keep this hidden somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere personal. That night, I placed it inside an old ceramic jar of David's childhood marbles, sealed it, and buried it under the hydrangeas by the fence. The irony wasn't lost on me. The proof of his life buried beside the symbol of our youth. Sleep didn't come easy. My mind replayed the files, the list of names, men and women erased for knowing too much. My brother hadn't died chasing profit, he'd died trying to bring truth into daylight. And now, by finding him again, I'd inherited that unfinished duty. The next morning, I called Harris. "What do we do now?" His voice was steady, but grave. "We take it to someone clean. I've got a contact in the district attorney's office, old friend, still believes in justice. But once this leaves our hands, there's no going back." I looked out the window toward the garden, where morning light fell over the hydrangeas, hiding the flash drive. "Then, let's go forward," I said, "for David." As I hung up, the faint rumble of a car echoed down the road. Another black sedan, same make as before, paused by the curb. My heart pounded, but this time, fear wasn't the only thing alive inside me. I had evidence now and purpose. Whatever they'd started 6 years ago, I intended to finish. That night, the world I thought I'd buried came roaring back to life. The prepaid phone buzzed in my pocket just past midnight, a number with no ID. A voice I hadn't heard since the day of the fire. "It's me," he whispered. "David." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. He wanted to meet no police, no recordings, just somewhere quiet. The next afternoon, I drove 2 hours to a crumbling roadside motel off Highway 9, the kind that smelled of stale smoke and rain. When I saw him step out of the shadows, I almost didn't recognize him. His hair was gray at the edges, his frame thinner, his eyes darting at every sound. "They tried to kill me," he said, voice trembling. "It wasn't an accident. I was going to testify, they found out." My chest tightened as he reached into his coat and slid a small notebook across the table, his hands shaking. "It has names. I just need protection." I nodded, ready to drive him straight to Harris. But before I could rise, twin beams of light cut through the motel curtains, a black SUV idling outside. David's face went pale. They found us. The first shot shattered the window, spraying glass across the bed. We dropped to the floor, crawling toward the bathroom as another round cracked through the door. My heart pounded against my ribs. David grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the back exit. "This way," he hissed. We ran out into the rain, the sound of footsteps closing in behind us. Bullets tore through the metal siding as we sprinted into the dark alley behind the motel. My legs burned, lungs screaming, but adrenaline kept me moving. We dove behind a dumpster, gasping, drenched, and shaking. For a moment, everything went still except the hum of the storm. David clutched his side, blood seeping through his shirt, but he managed a broken whisper. "They can't find the drive. Promise me." Then he pressed something cold and metallic into my palm, the flash drive Harris had found copies of before collapsing against me. Sirens wailed in the distance, but the SUV was already gone. I looked down at David, alive but fatting, and realized the reunion I'd prayed for had become a manhunt. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. By dawn, I had driven David straight to Harris's safe house on the outskirts of town. A small cabin tucked between pine trees and the sound of distant freight trains. Harris didn't waste a second. He patched David's wound, then began photographing every document, every file, every line of code on the flash drive. The drive contained shipment manifests, falsified death reports, and a network of shell companies laundering millions through medical transport contracts. It wasn't just corruption. It was an empire built on fake deaths and stolen identities. "This can't go local," Harris said grimly. "We go federal." Within hours, he contacted a friend at the Justice Department who specialized in organized financial crimes. Using encrypted channels, they transferred the drive, along with Harris's full report and a sworn affidavit. Every step was documented, timestamped, witnessed. For the first time since that doorbell rang, I felt a thin thread of control returning to my life. David, exhausted but lucid, recounted everything. The night of the explosion, how his supervisor had warned him to disappear or die, and how they'd faked his body with an unclaimed cadaver. He'd been hidden in safe houses, then hunted when he tried to leak proof. Listening to him, I realized how deep the deception went, not just in paperwork, but in faith. For years, I'd trusted a system that declared him dead and closed the file with a seal. That same system now prepared to expose itself. 3 tense days followed. Harris stayed on his radio, coordinating updates from federal agents. David barely slept, packing the cabin, terrified that the men who chased us to the motel would return. Each noise outside made me flinch, an engine, a twig snapping, even the wind. Then, early Friday morning, Harris got the call. "They're moving," he said simply. By noon, 3 simultaneous raids unfolded across the coast, at the dockyard warehouse, a transport office near the bay, and a storage facility registered to a front company called Blue Harbor Logistics. Dozens of agents in black vests stormed the sites. I watched the coverage on live television, heart pounding as aerial footage showed crates being opened, files seized, men in suits led out in handcuffs. Newscasters repeated the same headline: "Dockside Resurrection Scheme Exposed. Fake Death Network Under Investigation." The story spread nationwide within hours. Reporters pieced together fragments from the evidence Harris had submitted. They named executives, insurance officers, and even a county coroner who'd been paid to falsify records, the same one who had signed David's death certificate. Seeing those faces on screen felt surreal, like watching the ending of a nightmare I'd lived for a decade. By evening, federal protection agents arrived for David. They escorted him to a secure location for witness testimony. Before he left, he took my hands in his, frail, trembling, but alive. "You saved me twice," he said softly, "once from death and once from disappearing." I wanted to hold him, to promise everything would go back to normal, but I knew it wouldn't. Some truths change the shape of a life forever. That night, I stood in my kitchen watching the rain tap against the window. The garden lights glowed faintly, reflecting off the wet soil where I used to sit talking to David's photograph. Only now, I didn't need to talk to the past. It was breathing again, scarred but real. The world had seen the proof, the files, the headlines. Justice wasn't quiet anymore. For years, the truth had lived in the shadows of a sealed folder. But now it stood in daylight, undeniable, documented, and finally believed. The courthouse felt colder than I remembered, not from temperature, but from weight. The kind that settles over a place where lives are measured, not by what they lived, but by what they lost. Rows of journalists filled the benches, notebooks open, cameras poised. Every whisper seemed to echo off the marble walls. As I took my seat behind the witness barrier, I could see David across the room, dressed in a plain gray suit, flanked by 2 federal marshals. For a moment, he looked like the brother I'd buried years ago. Except now, he was flesh and breathing, bearing the scars of a life spent underground. When the judge entered, the room rose. Court is now in session for the United States versus Cartwell Shipping and Associates. The names sounded sterile, corporate, but behind them were men who had built a fortune by faking death itself. As opening statements began, the prosecution laid everything bare: falsified death certificates, hidden accounts, staged accidents, and insurance claims totaling over $60 million. The defense tried to dismiss David as a delusional ex-employee seeking immunity. But then the flash drive was presented, sealed, verified, and logged into evidence. The illusion began to crack. When David was called to testify, I held my breath. He walked to the stand slowly, a slight limp still marking every step. Under oath, he told the story we had both carried like a wound: the bribes, the forged reports, the night of the explosion when he'd been ordered to vanish or die. His voice wavered only once when he said, "I thought my sister would never forgive me for the lie that saved my life." The courtroom went silent. Even the defense attorney lowered his pen. The cross-examination was brutal. The opposing lawyer pushed him hard, implying he'd chosen greed, that he'd staged his own death for money. But David didn't flinch. "If I wanted money," he said, "I wouldn't have handed over proof that could send me to prison. I wanted my conscience back." That line hit me like thunder. For years, I had wondered if he'd ever thought of the pain his death caused. Now I saw it written in every tremor of his hands. Over the following days, witnesses took the stand: a former accountant who confirmed the falsified ledgers, a dock worker who described seeing body doubles, even a forensic analyst who matched the coroner's forged seals. Piece by piece, the illusion unraveled until there was nothing left but truth. The defense grew quieter. The jurors leaned forward. The empire built on ashes was turning to dust in real time. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand with the steadiness of someone who had nothing left to lose. I told the court how I'd signed the death certificate, how I'd buried a sealed casket, how I'd whispered apologies into a framed photograph for 6 years. My voice cracked only once when I said, "Grief doesn't end when you find out it was built on a lie. It just changes shape." The judge nodded slightly, her gaze soft but unreadable. After weeks of testimony, closing arguments came down to a single truth. This was never about one man's death, but about a system's willingness to look away. The prosecutor's final words still echo in my mind. These defendants didn't just forge papers, they forged peace for families who trusted them. When the verdict was read, the room held its breath. Guilty on all major counts: fraud, racketeering, conspiracy, falsified deaths. The judge's voice was firm, resonant. This was a deception built on ashes, and today those ashes no longer hide the truth. Cameras flashed as the convicted executives were led away in cuffs. David sat still, staring at the table before him, tears sliding silently down his face. I didn't know if they were for relief or for the years that could never be returned. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Microphones thrust forward, lights glaring. Someone shouted, "Mrs. Lewis, how does it feel to see your brother alive again?" I paused, looking past the crowd to the sky streaked with late afternoon light. It feels, I said slowly, like forgiveness isn't about forgetting the lie. It's about recognizing the courage it takes to tell the truth. That evening, David and I sat together on my porch for the first time since his so-called funeral. He looked thinner, older, but there was peace in his eyes. "You were right to sign those papers back then," he told me. "You didn't bury me. You buried what they made me become." I reached for his hand and said, "Then let's start digging each other back out." In that quiet, I realized something. Truth doesn't erase pain, but it anchors it, makes it real, livable. The illusion of death had ruled our lives for too long, but truth had permanence. It stood taller than fear, louder than lies, and finally, it had a name, Lewis. For months after the trial, the world felt strangely still, not peaceful, but suspended, as if time itself was catching its breath. David was placed under federal witness protection until the last of the appeals cleared. I didn't know where he was or what name he was using, only that he was alive somewhere under a sky that finally belonged to him. Then, one morning, a plain envelope arrived with no return address. Inside was a single handwritten page. "I'm safe, Margaret, starting over. The days are quiet, and sometimes I even sleep through the night. Tell the garden I miss it. Tell yourself I'm proud of you. David." I must have read that note 100 times before framing it next to the yellowed funeral notice I'd once thought was final. The two papers sat side by side, one declaring him gone, the other proving he'd never truly left. It was strange comfort, the kind that comes not from forgetting the past, but learning to coexist with it. Every month after that, another letter arrived. He never wrote much, a few lines about a new job, a borrowed dog, a small apartment near a river. But each one pulled me closer to the brother I thought the world had stolen. In my own life, I began to let the quiet in. I tended my garden again, planting marigolds where the lilies used to be, flowers that didn't mind the scars of old soil. The neighbors still whispered about the miracle case, about how my brother had come back from the dead. I stopped correcting them. Some stories don't need straight lines. They just need to be believed in. Sometimes, on cool evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea and reread our letters, hearing his voice between the words. There was always a trace of guilt in his tone, a need to atone for what he'd done, but I never held that over him. We'd both lived in separate prisons, his built from fear, mine from mourning. Freedom, I realized, wasn't about leaving those walls behind. It was about choosing to walk through the open door together. When he was finally released from protection, he called me from a number I didn't recognize. "It's really me this time," he said, and I could hear the wind in the background, soft and open. "You sound lighter," I told him. He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard in nearly a decade. "That's because for once, I don't have to hide." He lives now in a small town 3 states away, running a repair shop by the water. He writes every few weeks, sometimes enclosing a pressed flower, sometimes a photo of the sunrise from his workshop window. In one of his letters, he wrote, "We used to think survival meant keeping secrets. Maybe it actually means telling the truth and surviving anyway." I keep that line on my refrigerator, right above the photo of us as children, me in pigtails, him grinning with a scraped knee, both of us barefoot on the Ohio dirt. That picture used to ache to look at. Now it feels like home again. Rebuilding a family after death, real or faked, isn't about pretending nothing broke. It's about tending to what's left, watering what can still grow. I lost 6 years to silence, but in return, I gained a version of my brother who finally understood what life was worth. And in a way, that feels like resurrection too, not the kind stamped by officials, but the kind only love can certify. The porch light flickered softly as dawn stretched over the horizon, painting the world in quiet gold. I sat in the same spot where it all began, the same creaking chair, the same view of the front door, the same security camera perched above it, like a silent witness. 6 years ago, that lens captured a ghost I thought I'd buried. Now, it only caught sunlight filtering through the garden my brother once promised to help me plant. Funny how the same device that once froze my blood now felt like an emblem of peace. Proof, perhaps, that truth can redeem even the tools of fear. The house was still, save for the kettle whistling in the kitchen and the slow hum of the refrigerator. For the first time in a long time, those ordinary sounds didn't feel hollow. They sounded like living. When people ask me what it felt like to lose a brother twice and get him back once, I tell them it's like standing between two mirrors, one reflecting the worst night of your life and the other reflecting the dawn after. Between them, somewhere, is grace. Justice came, but not the kind that rewinds time. No verdict could give back the years David and I lost, the birthdays missed, the nights spent believing a lie. Yet when the truth came out, when the headlines named the guilty, and the world believed the story I had screamed into silence, something inside me healed. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Because sometimes justice doesn't raise the dead. It simply brings the truth to light, and that light is enough to live by. I still check the camera feed every night before bed, habit, not fear. The image of the porch, the walkway, the garden's edge reminds me how far we've come. The woman I was that night, trembling, alone, whispering, that can't be real, would never have imagined sitting here in peace. Back then, I thought survival meant locking doors. Now, I know it means opening them again. There's a kind of poetry in endings that circle back to their beginnings. The first time I sat here in the dark, I was waiting for danger to leave. Tonight, I wait for the sun to rise. In both moments, the world feels suspended, holding its breath. The difference is, this time, I'm not afraid of what it will reveal. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that truth has its own stubborn heartbeat. You can bury it under paperwork, seal it behind false signatures, even stamp it with official approval. But one day, it will surface. It always does. And when it does, it asks for something simple, a witness, someone willing to see and not look away. Someone like you, listening to this story, holding space for it. So before I close this chapter, I'll ask you something, not as a narrator, but as another human being who's seen both darkness and dawn. Have you ever seen something you weren't meant to see, but couldn't ignore? Something that asked for courage you didn't know you had. Maybe it was a secret, a betrayal, a quiet wrong that no one else would name. If you have, then you already know what I've learned. Silence protects the wrong people, and truth, however painful, is the only thing that truly sets us free. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. A city window, a country porch, a quiet kitchen with a single lamp burning. Wherever you are, I want to hear your truth. Because every story like mine begins with one small act of seeing, and every truth deserves a witness.